All right, tonight we're going to look at the book of Job. We're going to start a little series on the book of Job. And Job is universally applicable. And the reason it's universally applicable is because it's about suffering and how to handle suffering and what happens when you suffer and some of the obstacles that you'll run into and that kind of thing. And basically, everybody suffers. In fact, that's one of the reasons that we know that there's some allegory in here that we're going to get to in just a little bit. But let's see. One of the things I'd like to do is when we read Job, what I've learned is to read it a little more slowly, read it a little more prayerfully, read it a little more thoughtfully. What is God doing? What could Jesus Christ have learned from this? If Jesus Christ was reading the book of Job, which of course he did, we believe Job is the oldest book in the Bible, which, by the way, may make it the oldest document in history that we have in history. It's quite possible that because Job, if he was approximately the time of Abraham, 2,000 years BC, that would predate a lot of the other documents that we have, obviously. But points that we'll hear about in the book of Job, points that will come up is obviously righteous people suffer. And that it's amazing how many people are taken out of their game, abandon their faith, begin to distrust God or whatever you want to call it, because they or someone they love is suffering. And yet the book of Job shows that righteous, innocent people suffer. And it's not God's fault, it's the devil's fault. And we need to put blame where blame is due. So Job points out that righteous people suffer, innocent people suffer. It points out in a number of ways that it's the devil who's the accuser. In fact, he shows up as Satan, which Satan itself means the adversary. So, God doesn't show up as the adversary. The very name of Satan is that he's the adversary and he's the problem. One of the things that we see in Job is that Satan is never satisfied with the harm that he does. You won't find any place in the Bible where Satan kind of says, okay, I've done enough harm. I'm going to back off for a while. He doesn't do it. He's relentless and he's evil and he pushes and pushes and pushes. And we see that here in the book of Job. Another lesson we learned from the book of Job is enjoy what you have now because you may not have it later. Enjoy your health, enjoy whatever there is in your life that's enjoyable. Go ahead and enjoy it. That kind of stuff doesn't live forever. Another thing we learn is that hang in through tough times. When things get tough, that's not the time to give up. God will teach you things in the midst of your suffering. He will show you things if we will hang tough and believe in God. And of course, there's rewards at the judgment as well. So, in fact, if you read, there's books out there, one by Kushner, called When Bad Things Happen to Good People and that kind of thing. It so often happens that somebody who's going through a trial or some kind of trouble and they're faithful and they come out on the other side better people. That happens so often that if you talk to Christians around the world, that's one of the reasons that they think God causes the sufferings. And they'll tell you, well, I went through this horrible time of suffering, but after I was through, I was such a better person. So I know God did it to me. It's like, no, what God did was work with you in the midst of the suffering so that you became a better person. But He didn't cause the suffering so that you become a better person. And it's really important just to get that straight. Because if you believe that God caused your suffering and now you're a better person, then when someone in your sphere of influence is really hurting, then the tendency is to go to them and say, well, I know it's difficult now, but if you just hang in, you'll be a better person later. And that really rings hollow to people. And some people don't come out on the other side. they're dying of cancer and they're in pain or something like that, and they end up dead. They didn't come out on the other side. So it's very important that you and I separate. God doesn't cause the suffering. But if we hang tough in it and keep our trust in God and prayer to God and friendship with other believers, many, many times we will come out on the other side of it as better people. And of course, keep the hope in mind. We know that there's a better future ahead. We absolutely know it. So that having been said, let's go to Job chapter 1. And the Bible says there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. A couple things about this. Job was a real character. He's mentioned in other places of the Bible. Some liberal theologians say the whole story is made up. That's not true. The book of Job occurs, for example, in the book of Jeremiah and other places. And we hear in the New Testament about the patience of Job and that kind of thing. I'm going to share my screen again just for a second. And this time I will make sure I know how to get it back. But if I share here, so here's a map of the Middle East, and when it says there's a man in the land of Uz, what we understand, there's two likely possibilities for Uz, one much more likely than the other. Here's the Dead Sea right here. Down here, just south of the Dead Sea, is Edom. The land of Uz kind of ran along the south end of the Jordan River and swung out into the Arabian desert. And this would be the land of Uz. There's a lesser identification that it's higher up, higher north, more in this direction. But most conservative scholars place the land of Uz here, east of the Dead Sea, east of the nearer part of the Transjordan, going out into the Arabian desert. And as far as the name Job, conservative scholars like Bullinger and some others think that his name means attacked or persecuted or afflicted in that genre of meaning. There are lots and lots of scholars who debate that and say, no, it means this other thing or this other thing. If you look in Bible dictionaries and study Bibles and stuff like that, you'll probably find 8, 9 different positions that scholars have on what the name Job means. I've never found anything better than what Bullinger and some of the other conservative scholars did, that it means the attacked one, which means that the book of Job would have been composed after Job had gone through his afflictions. And so when people referred to him, they referred to him as the persecuted one, the afflicted one, the attacked one, something like that. So but he was a real man. And he lived in the Uz, and he lived approximately the same time as Abraham. So about 2000-ish BC. And it says that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. And it's kind of interesting that the way these terms are put together, because when you read the word blameless, it puts the emphasis on what he doesn't do. That he's blameless because he doesn't sin, he doesn't get drunk, he doesn't do this, he doesn't do that. And then when you put the emphasis on upright, it puts the emphasis on what he does do, how he obeys God, how he helps other people, how he's a kind and gentle person and that kind of thing. So he's blameless, he doesn't do wrong, and he's upright, he does do what's right. He feared God, which is doing right, and turned away from evil, didn't do wrong. So that's what's going on there. It's covering the full basis. He turns away from what's wrong and he does what is right. And that becomes really important. Now remember, when this verse says he was blameless and upright, this is before the Mosaic Law. In fact, it's probably at least 500 years before the Mosaic Law. So now, normally when you and I, when we're reading through the book of Kings or something like that, and we read somebody was blameless or whatever, then we do that in relation to the Mosaic Law. Oh, they must do the sacrifices, they must do this, they must do that. How can you be blameless and upright before the Mosaic Law? And this is where embedded in the heart of every person is a moral law. This is one of the reasons that God can judge every human being on the day of judgment. Every human being has embedded in their soul a moral law. If we look at Genesis chapter 3, this is when we'll be using the magnifying glass here in just a second. But in Genesis chapter 3, and we run down to verse 22, so this is after Adam and Eve have sinned. Eve and Adam partook of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so in verse 22, Yahweh said, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil." And this is not a believer's manifesto. This is a creation ordinance. Human beings know good from evil. You know, I've got a 3-year-old granddaughter, and I've got kind of nieces and nephews that are in the same age. And I will tell you, if one of those little babies takes a toy from another little baby, that other little baby knows that something's been wrong. There's something wrong, and they complain loudly about it. And so from the youngest age, children, if they were raised properly, would know right from wrong. God speaks about this in Romans. This, by the way, is in Romans chapter 2. We can go to Romans chapter 2. Many times I remember being asked, what, especially as a young Christian, well, what about, I don't know what was so big about Borneo when I was in college, but it was always Borneo. It's like, well, what about the people in Borneo, the natives in Borneo that have never heard of Jesus Christ, that never heard of the Word of God? And how can God be fair if he's not going to save them because they haven't heard of Jesus Christ? And for, a long time, I didn't know the answer to that. And now I do. If you've never heard of Jesus Christ, you've never had a chance to believe, then God judges you according to the law of your conscience. And that's very clearly written in Romans 2. Verse 13 says, "Now it's not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God," which, amen to that. There's a lot of people that hear the law and don't believe it, don't obey it. But it goes on to say, "But those who do the law will be declared righteous. For whenever the Gentiles who do not have the law," now remember, this is Romans 2. So Jesus Christ has only been dead now for what, 25 years or less? So there's a whole bunch of people in the Roman world that the Apostle Paul was addressing that had not heard of Jesus Christ. And so he's answering the question, well, what about these people who haven't heard? Well, whenever the Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature, there's your key word, they do by nature, God said, "Behold, man has become as one of us, knowing good and evil." And people know good from evil. So here it is, the Gentiles do by nature the things required by the law. And remember, Christ said, love God, love your neighbor. On these two commandments hang the entire law and the prophets. And it isn't difficult to understand what's loving somebody from what's being selfish or hurtful, harmful, that kind of thing. We know that when people lie to us, we are hurt. We know lying is wrong. We know stealing is wrong, that kind of thing. When the Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature the things required by law, they are a law to themselves, even though they don't have the law, since they demonstrate that the work of the law is written on their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and accusing and excusing on the day when God, through Jesus Christ, will judge. So Christ is still going to be the judge, but he'll have a different standard of judgment instead of just believing me and that kind of thing. So it's important to get that back with Job, because when it says he was blameless and upright, it doesn't mean there was a law written yet, but the moral law on the heart was very clear. And Job did that. In verse 2, then it says there were 7 sons and 3 daughters. Verse 2, there was born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. That would be considered the perfect family. Remember, at that time, you wanted a lot of sons because there was no police force. So the size of your family was the only thing that protected you, and generally speaking, that meant sons. But also, when the sons, because of what they brought to the family with strength and protection, they stayed with the mom and dad. And when the sons married, the women moved in with them. So if you had sons, then your family would grow because the sons would bring in women. And then those women, when they had children, they would be part of your clan, not the mother's original clan or the wife's original clan. And then, of course, 3 daughters, because you do need help around the house. The daughters, somewhere in the neighborhood of 13, 14, 15, would marry and go away, but there would be a tremendous amount of help before they got to 13, 14, 15, that type of thing. So the 7 sons and 3 daughters is a picture of Job in kind of the perfect family setting. Verse 3, his possessions also were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, which were more valuable than the male donkeys because they bred more donkeys, and a very large number of slaves, so that this man was the greatest of all the children of the East. Now, the children of the East is a technical term. It occurs 11 times in the Old Testament. It's for people that live in the area of Uz on what we would call the western side of the big Arabian Peninsula, that big Arabian desert. If you remember, and you might or might not, but when in the Judges period, when the Midianites were coming across the Jordan River and afflicting Israel during the time of Gideon, the Midianites joined up with the children of the East to afflict Israel. And there were other times as well. You can do a simple phrase search for the children of the East and you'll see where they show up. But in any case, this tells us that Job was the greatest man of all the children of the East. Verse 4, his sons used to hold a feast, each in his house on his day. And what that exactly means, nobody's been able to figure out, or at least figure out to the satisfaction of all. What does his day mean? Various suggestions have been set forth, none of them particularly satisfying to me. But I think it's important that his sons used to hold a feast, each, and there's 7 of them, so there's going to be a lot of feasting. And they would send and call for their 3 sisters to eat and to drink with them. And that's important too, because it shows that Job built a tight family. Job was the family priest. He was the family patriarch. He took his responsibilities seriously. He talked to his family about togetherness, about mutual support, about the value of family first, that kind of thing. And that's still important to do. The family is still supposed to be the unit, the primary unit of any society on God's earth. And so Job here was made sure that he raised his family well, and his family liked each other, supported each other, did things together, and so they would feast. Verse 5. And by the way, since they're wealthy, they'd have, of course, plenty of meat and plenty of alcohol. Verse 5. And when the days of their feasting had run its course, Job would send and have them ritually cleaned. As the patriarch in this time period before the law of Moses and the Aaronic priesthood, then the patriarch of the family was the priest. Job realized that, and he took that seriously. And so here he's having his family cleansed. Did he have a particular reason for it? No. It says he rose up early in the morning and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job says, it may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. And as the family priest, it was his job to make sure that there was covering if they had sinned, kind of like Leviticus 16 and the Day of Atonement, where the Day of Atonement covered the sins for the people of Israel, whether they were confessed or unconfessed or whatever. That's what the Day of Atonement did with the goat that was sent out to Azazel and the goat that was sacrificed. So he's doing burnt offerings for his children. He said, it may be my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. And realistically, if his sons and daughters and their wives and their families are all feasting and you get into some kind of family squabble, or who knows what happens in those days, it'd be pretty easy for somebody to speak offhand and and say something that would be considered a curse, that kind of thing. And so Job is covering that, and he did this regularly. So what these opening 5 verses are doing is they're painting a picture that Job's a real person. He lived in a real place at a real time. He had a real family. He really took his responsibilities seriously, and he was genuinely upright and blameless. And as I was reading this, and I said, we need to read this slowly and carefully. When I was reading this over the last few days and reflecting on it, it occurred to me that even people who aren't Christian, who don't, have a Bible and read it and stuff, there should be some kind of alarm that goes off inside them that says, I'm supposed to be kind. I'm supposed to not lie. I'm supposed to not steal. I'm supposed to treat other people like I would like to be treated. And that's something that we can talk to people about, because even if Christians think that way, we want to elevate it a notch and say, I want to be like Christ. But sometimes it just helps to think of being kind and good and respectful and that kind of thing. And Job certainly was. So then we come to verse 6 and we introduce Satan. So it says, one day when the sons of God came to present themselves before Yahweh, Satan also came among them. There's a lot here in this verse, so we need to unpack it. First of all, it says, one day when the sons of God came to present themselves before Yahweh. The sons of God in Hebrew is the B'nai Ha-Elohim, literally the sons of God. And when you look at that phrase in Hebrew and run it through the Bible, every son of God that with that term is a created being of God. So Adam is called a B'nai Ha-Elohim, but not Eve, because Adam was a direct creation of God. The angels are B'nai Ha-Elohim. They are direct creations of God. In Genesis 6, when it says, the B'nai Ha-Elohim saw the daughters of men. These are God's fallen angels. We know from Jude and Peter, they by that time had become what you and I know as demons. They got with the girls and impregnated them, generally by manipulating their genetics, not because angels can have sex with a girl and get a girl pregnant, but in the same way that the spirit world affected the plants and animals genetically, so they changed. That's what happened in Genesis 6 with the women, and you produced a race called the Nephilim, from the Hebrew word Nephal, which means fallen. So it's a race of the fallen ones, and they became the Nephilim that we read about in the Old Testament. So this is the sons of God. Now there are versions that try to be helpful, like the NIV, and it takes the word son of God. And I appreciate them wanting to be helpful, but they translate it as angels. And one day when the angels came to present themselves before Yahweh, well, I certainly there were angels there. Angels are B'nai Ha-Elohim, so angels are created beings of God. But there's a whole bunch of things that God created that aren't angels. He created the cherubim and the seraphim and whatever those creatures are in the book of Revelation, that it just calls them living beings that have eyes all over them and that kind of thing. And it's where Ephesians talks about every family in heaven and earth is named. So when God created the earth and populated it with all these different things, we would be kind of shortchanging God to think that heaven didn't have different kind of creatures. And we know from Isaiah and Ezekiel that heaven is colorful, and so it would have different. And so this is a time when at least many of those creatures came to present themselves before Yahweh, which makes perfect sense. Yahweh would be a creator to them, a father to them. He would be working with them, coaching them, asking them about their welfare, that kind of thing, like any good father would. And so these beings came, and it says, and Satan also came among them. And by this time, of course, Satan, already in the word Satan, it's transliterated from the Hebrew, So this just was in the Hebrew, it's Satan. And so they brought it over into English as Satan. But the word in Hebrew means adversary. So it probably would have been more helpful if starting way back in the 1500s with Tyndale and Wycliffe's translations and 1599 with the Geneva translation, that kind of thing, if they had translated Satan rather than transliterated it. Because what happens is we lose the meaning of the name. We import an idea that, oh yeah, he's the devil, so he's red, he's got horns, he carries a pitchfork. We import all these kind of crazy ideas to it. But really, honestly, we'd have been better off if we'd simply translated the word and just used capital A, adversary, every time it appeared. I started doing that in the REV a number of years ago, but then some of the readers, and Janet Speaks would remember this, said, we don't know what this is talking about. It doesn't make sense to us. We know who the devil is, but so we went back to Satan, made everybody happy, and covered it in commentary. But in any case, so Satan came among them. Now, by this time, Satan is a tremendous adversary to God. And Satan started out on the holy mountain of God and was a member of God's divine council, and he was on the Mount of Assembly. You can read this in Isaiah chapter 14, starting, I think, in verse 13, and in Ezekiel chapter 28, starting in verse 14, if I remember correctly. And so here's Satan. And it's interesting that verse 6 says Satan also came among them. Satan used to be a member of God's intimate divine council, helping God to rule the world, but he got kicked out because of his evil, but he shows up here. So if you're us, or if you're Jesus Christ and you're reading this, now what's going to happen is we get some insight into Satan, the adversary. And it starts out, so Satan came among them. Yahweh said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Then Satan answered Yahweh and said, "From going back and forth on earth and from walking up and down on it." Now, that's a prevarication. When God says, "Where have you come from?" And I really appreciate the scholars on this. They get the fact, they're in heaven, Satan says, "Earth." It's like, thanks, that's unhelpful. I knew you came from earth. What he's actually asking here, when he said, "Where have you come from?" It's more almost like, what have you come from doing? Where have you come from doing things? In other words, give an account of your activities. What have you been doing on earth? And the scholars are good. They pick up on that. Where have you come from? Give me a report about what you're doing in your activities. But Satan answered Yahweh and said, "From going back and forth on the earth and from walking up and down on it." Was he doing that? Yes, he was. And this is where Satan is very, if you know the English word prevarication, it's a great word, especially if you have teenagers, you have to know that word. Prevarication is when you say something that's true in such a manner that it hides what you want to hide. What Satan should have said was, "Well, I've been walking up and down on the earth trying to kill people, seeking the people that I can devour," like 1 Peter 5:8 says. So he wants to get the people that he can devour, but he doesn't want to divulge that to God. So what he does is he throws out this prevarication, this half-truth, from going back and forth on the earth, from walking up and down it. It's like, yeah, right, that's meaningless. But that's one of the things that Satan does. And when we know that, then we can look for that in Satan and look for that in Satan's people. They will prevaricate, tell you half-truths. They will outright lie, which Satan also does. And they're very bold in the way they do it. So verse 8, Yahweh said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there's none like him on earth, a blameless and upright man." Same thing as we saw up toward verse 3 or 2 or 3. Yeah, verse 1 actually. Blameless and upright man, one who fears God and turns away from evil. Now, this book is about Job. And so in this case, God said, have you considered my servant Job? But if you think about the number of people there might have been that walked blamelessly, there's probably millions of people on earth. There are other people that are walking blamelessly. Job is about the suffering of the innocent. The book of Job is about the suffering of the innocent, and that's surely here. But there's a whole bunch. I mean, there's just so many people on earth who are innocent, who are suffering. So that God could have said this about a number of people, probably. Certainly, I would think in today's world he could. I know lots and lots of really good Christians. So he said, there's no man, verse 8, there's none like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. Verse 9, then Satan answered Yahweh and says, does Job fear God for no reason? And so what goes on now is you and I get a look into Satan's heart. Satan is suspicious. He doesn't like people. He doesn't trust people. He doesn't even trust his own demons. He rules with an iron fist by power and by fear. And it couldn't cross his mind that somebody could simply be thankful to God because God gave them life. Satan has to believe there's something you're getting, Job. There's some benefit you're getting from thanking God, loving God, serving God, and that's why you do it. And if you didn't get that benefit, you wouldn't do it. And that's a black heart. That's a suspicious heart, because there's all kinds of people that just simply love and serve God because God's their creator and God's their sustainer. And that's as simple as it is. And he says in verse, says in verse 9, I want to go, I want to make sure I'm covering in my notes. Quick break here. Yeah, okay. So back to verse 9. Satan answered, Yahweh said, does Job fear God for no reason? Verse 10, haven't you made a hedge about him on every side and around his household and around all that he has? You have blessed the work of his hand, and his livestock and his livestock has spread out over the land. So I don't know whether God made a hedge around Job in a way that he did something for Job that he didn't do for other people. Satan's going to pretend that he did. Satan's going to exaggerate that. Haven't you made this hedge around him? And so you've blessed him and he's spread out. Like God wouldn't do that for anybody. And I'm sure actually God had done that for other people. But what we're seeing here is the adversary's suspicion. Verse 11. He says, but stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and surely he will curse you to your face. And when it says that, stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, that's what Satan would like to have happen to everyone. Satan would like for everyone's life to be ruined. And so he says, if you touch what he has, he'll curse you to your face. And that comes again from Satan's false belief that nobody could possibly love God and serve God unless God was doing something material for them. And so here he says, well, take away what he has and he'll curse you to your face, which is very bold, by the way. Curse you to your face means curse you openly, not curse you behind your back or that kind of thing. Verse 12. So Yahweh said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand, only do not stretch out your hand against him. So Satan went out from the presence of Yahweh. Now this has been misread for generations. We need to get this right. Verse 12 is a lot of the material substance behind the belief, the Calvinistic belief that God's in control of everything, behind the belief that Satan can only do what God gives him permission to do. There's a lot of erroneous doctrine that comes out of a misunderstanding of verse 12. To understand it properly, we've got to realize that there's two parts to verse 12. Yahweh said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. That's not permission. That's a statement of fact. This is, if this is 2000 BC-ish, this is 2000 years after the flood. Satan's been the god of this age, the ruler of the world, the prince of the power of the air, the cause of all kinds of evil for 2000 years. And 1 John 5:19 says in the NIV that the devil controls the world. Probably a better translation is he has sway over the world or great influence over the world, that kind of thing. We know from Hebrews 2:14, he has the power of death. We know that from Ephesians 6 and other things, that he goes against believers. So when the devil was talking to Jesus Christ in Luke chapter 4, we might as well just go there. Let's take a quick look at Luke chapter 4. This is important because in Luke chapter 4, the devil's going to play all his whole hand. Verse 5 of Luke 4. And he, the devil, led him, Jesus, up and showed him all the kingdoms of the inhabited world in a moment of time that had to be by some kind of visual revelation. Verse 6, and the devil said to him, to you I will give all this authority and their glory, for it's been handed over to me. Handed over by who? By Adam and Eve. And I can give it to anyone I want to. Therefore, if you will bow down and worship before me, it will all be yours. So the devil said, I'll give you the kingdoms and their glory all over the world, and the authority all over the world. The devil himself got it from Adam and Eve. When God gave Adam the dominion over the world, Adam transferred that to the devil. So now we're in verse 12, back in Job. When God says the first statement, behold, all that he has is in your hand, that's a simple statement of fact. It is not God giving permission to the devil to smite Job. The devil already can do that. And one of the reasons we know that is he's afflicted people all over the world for 2,000 years. So God simply says, look, all that he has is in your hand. And then God, in the spiritual battle between good and evil, can put up barriers, just like, for example, when Daniel asked God to answer a prayer in Daniel, and Daniel sent an angel, then the demon that was in control of Persia stopped the angel, and Michael had to get involved and release the angel so it could answer Daniel's question. So God is in the spiritual battle able to set up barriers that to a degree limit what Satan can do. So what's going on here is Yahweh says to Satan, look, he's in your hand, but I'm going to send my forces and I'm not going to allow you to bring a hand against him personally. And so Satan knew he'd be in a war if that would happen. And there's a real war between good and evil. That shows up in many places in the Bible. Let's see an easy one. Let's go to Revelation chapter 12. And in Revelation chapter 12, and starting in verse 7, it says, and there was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels went to fight with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. So this is a genuine war in heaven. It's a war that will occur in the future. Michael and God's angels will fight with the devil. The devil and his fallen angels, his demons, are going to fight back. Verse 8, and they were not strong enough, nor was there a place for them in heaven anymore. So at that point, verse 9, the great dragon was thrown down. So, for example, when we read in Job that Satan showed up in the heavenlies, in the future, those heavenlies are going to be closed to him. Michael and his angels are going to protect, the heavenly boundary from Satan and his demons. And I bring this up because what verse 12 is not saying is that God's just saying, okay, well, I give you permission to smite Job, But also I don't want you doing this, and then Satan has to do it. It doesn't work that way. Satan already had the ability to smite Job. And so God said, I'm gonna, if you try to touch him personally, I'm gonna send out my forces and stop it. So the next verse goes on, verse 12. So Satan went out from the presence of Yahweh. And then now we see the evil that Satan really is, that he just doesn't care about people, doesn't care about human life. Verse 13. Now one day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding nearby them when the Sabaeans attacked and took them away. Yes, they've struck down the servants with the mouth of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. The Sabaeans come out of Yemen. That's where the Sabaeans were located at this time, about 2000 BC. And I will tell you the truth. When I was reading this and thinking about it, I just wondered, it was just one of those flash wonderings, if the demons who were in the Sabaeans and who inspired them to come across the Arabian desert and attack Job, if those demons were still in the Houthis that are in Yemen now attacking Israel. I don't know. They could have moved on, but they may well have just stayed there. Verse 15, when it says, yes, they have struck down the servants with the mouth of the sword. The word mouth is used to show the cruelty of it, the all-consuming nature of it. They didn't spare anything. They killed everything. So the sword was just like a giant hungry mouth that just ate everything up, consumed everything. That's why it's called the mouth of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Verse 16, while he was still speaking, another also came and said, the fire of God is falling from heaven. That's sometimes used of just a plasma fire, but sometimes used of lightning, just a huge lightning storm, and has burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Verse 17, while he was still speaking, another also came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 bands and swept down on the camels and have taken them away, yes, and have struck down the servants with the mouth of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was still speaking, another came and said, your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, when suddenly a great wind came across the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. I alone have escaped to tell you. Verse 20, then Job arose and tore his cloak and shaved his head and dropped down onto the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came out of my mother's womb, and naked I will return there. Yahweh gave, and Yahweh has taken away. Blessed be the name of Yahweh. And it says in verse 22, and all this Job did not sin, nor did he charge God with wrongdoing. So Job's response is incredibly mature and incredibly honest. He worshiped God, and he believed that God was a good God, and that there was some kind of rhyme or reason or purpose for what he did. So when he had these tragedies, he dropped down, he worshiped, and he said, I came out of my mother's womb naked, and I will return there naked. God gave, God's taken away. Blessed be the name of Yahweh. Verse 22, in all this Job did not sin, nor did he charge God with wrongdoing. To understand that verse, we have to understand the time period that it was written in, because it was written in the Old Testament. It was written before Jesus Christ came. At the time that this was written, and you can see even by the chapter of Job and the way it's developed, God revealed himself as in charge of things, even through the idioms of the language. Like when it would say, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, or God sent the serpents that bit the people of Israel when they complained in the wilderness. And so from what Job, 2,000 years before Christ, knew about God, what God had revealed about himself. Job said, Yahweh gave and Yahweh has taken away. Now we march forward 2,000 years and we get to Jesus Christ. And what's Jesus Christ do? Jesus Christ reveals both God and the devil in a new light. So, for example, if we go to John chapter 1, and in John chapter 1 in verse 18, it says, no one has ever seen God, the only begotten Son, who's in the most intimate relationship with the Father. He has explained him. Jesus Christ revealed God as an always good, loving Father. If we go to Luke chapter 10, in Luke chapter 10, we get the opposite. In Luke chapter 10, we get, let's see, he sends out, let's see, he tells them, anyways, he sends them out to cast out devils and stuff like that. And verse 17, that's the verse I was looking for. In Luke chapter 10, verse 17, the 72 returned with joy, saying, Lord, even the demons submit to us in your name. Where did they learn about demons? And where would they learn to get demons to submit? See, Jesus Christ revealed a whole new light, a whole new understanding of God and the devil. And so, for example, down to verse 23, and turning to the disciples, he said privately, blessed are the eyes that see the things that you see. For I say to you that many prophets and kings desired to see the things that you see and didn't see them, and to hear the things that you hear and didn't hear them. So Jesus Christ revealed the devil in a brand new way. Let's look at Acts chapter 10. In Acts chapter 10, and you guys know this is not new revelation to you, that the New Testament, I'll just hit a couple verses, but in Acts chapter 10, verse 38, Jesus, the one from Nazareth, how God anointed him with Holy Spirit and with power, and he went around doing good and healing all those that were being oppressed by the devil. And so here there's an oppression by the devil, and that's exactly right. Now, I want to go back and talk about are there more reasons for us to understand and believe that God did not give permission to the devil to afflict Job? And there's a bunch of reasons. One, obviously, it makes God the reason for pain and suffering. Now, if you're a Calvinist, they would say, absolutely, God is the reason for pain and suffering. He does it because it's his pleasure and he's God. And that's as simple as it is. I have a problem with that. For one thing, God makes statements like, I am love. And if God is love, then at least in my world, in the way I think that the New Testament uses the word love, you can't be loving and do things that would be considered unloving. And saying that God has to give permission to the devil to hurt people makes God the reason for pain and suffering. Also, if we look at Proverbs, verses like Proverbs 10:22, let's go to Proverbs chapter 10, verse 22. And this is a different kind of verse, but similar. In Proverbs 10:22, it says, the blessing from Yahweh is what makes one rich, and he does not combine pain with the blessing. God is love, and the Bible specifically tells us God does not combine pain with the blessing. If God gave the devil permission to afflict Job after blessing Job the way he did, then this verse is not true. And pretty soon we get into the fact that then we can't trust the Bible. Another reason that we know that God couldn't have given the devil permission to afflict Job is that anytime you're doing the will of God, that's not sin. The Bible is very clear that the devil has been sinning from the beginning. Well, if the devil isn't breaking the commands of God, then he's not sinning. The only way he can be sinning is if he's breaking the commands of God. So God can't be giving him permission to kill people or afflict people. And then, of course, another thing is that the names that the Bible gives the devil would be wrong. Like Satan, we've talked about, means adversary. The word devil itself means slanderer. He's called the evil one. He's called the opposer. The devil's got a whole bunch of names, all which would be wrong if, in fact, the devil didn't do anything to people that he didn't get permission to do first. Another one, let's go to 1 John 3:8. And this becomes interesting because in 1 John 3:8, it talks about what the devil is doing and what Jesus Christ is doing. It says, verse 8, whoever continues to commit sin is of the devil, because the devil has been sinning from the beginning. The Son of God appeared for this purpose, to destroy the works of the devil. So now this makes sense. If the devil is just going off and doing what he has the authority to do because Adam gave him the authority to do, and it's evil, then it makes sense that Jesus Christ is going to destroy the works of the devil. And also that the devil had been sinning from the beginning. But if the devil has only been doing what God permits him to do, then Jesus Christ doesn't need to destroy those works. All that needs to happen is God just needs to say no, and we're done. And remember that Jesus Christ had stated very clearly that a kingdom divided itself can't stand, divided against itself. So if you've got God saying you can do this, and then Jesus Christ running behind him and destroying the works of the devil, you've got a kingdom divided against itself. And I'm going to close with this point on, it would mean that you and I as humans would be more powerful than the devil. Because I guarantee you the last time you sinned, you didn't go before the Lord and say, by the way, can I have permission to do this? You just sinned. We simply, if we're going to lie, if we're going to steal, if we're going to get drunk on a Friday night, if we're going to do whatever, we don't ask God, can I have permission to get drunk? He'd just say no. Of course he would, you know? And so we don't ask permission of God when we sin. So why would the devil have to ask permission of God when he sins? So heading back to Job chapter 1, verse 22, in all this Job did not sin, nor did he charge God with wrongdoing. If you and I said that today, we would be charging God, we would be sinning. We would be blaming God for something that he clearly, through his Son and through the New Testament authors, wrote that he did not do. But Job didn't have that information, so he can make statements like the Lord gave and the Lord's taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord, and he can do that without sinning. But you and I can't. So what we see here is we see Job, and one of the things we definitely can conclude is that he was blameless and upright, and yet he suffered horribly, and he suffered horribly because the devil is the ruler of the world, the God of this age, the prince of the power of the air. He has the authority to make people suffer, and he does. And if we can get that and realize that God is working on our behalf. In fact, let's just go to Romans 8. I wasn't going to do this. Let's just go one more verse, Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Make sure we get this translated properly and understood properly. Romans 8:28. Normally translated, all things work together for good. And that's one of the verses that people use to say, oh, I know it's terrible for you, but believe me, sooner or later, it's going to be good. It's not a good translation. It's not true. Verse 28 in the REV now, and by the way, the NIV reads this way as well. Now we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, for those who are called ones in accordance with his purpose. God is love, and he works for the good of those that love him. If you or someone you know are suffering, God is working for your good. Keep praying to him, hang tough, see how things turn out on the other side. But God is not your problem. The fallen nature of humankind, the fallen nature of the world, the devil and his followers are our problem. So thank you very much. I appreciate your being with me for this.